Memphis, Tennessee, December 1851. On a rain-soaked auction block near the Mississippi River, something happened that would haunt the city's commercial elite for decades. A single slave, a young man whose physical appearance defied every convention of the trade, sold for a price so astronomical that it triggered a chain of events no one could have predicted. Within 6 months, 3 of the wealthiest families in Memphis would be destroyed. Within a year, the buyer himself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic journal entries that suggested he'd uncovered something far more dangerous than simple commerce. The city's newspaper archives from that period contain inexplicable gaps, entire weeks missing, as if someone systematically removed evidence of what truly transpired. What made this particular slave so valuable that men were willing to risk everything to possess him? What secrets did his sale conceal that powerful families would rather erase from history? Before we continue with the story of what became known in whispered circles as the Memphis Enigma, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the antebellum South. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community across America. The truth behind this mystery begins not with the auction itself, but with the circumstances that brought this young man to Memphis in the first place. The spring of 1851 found Memphis in a state of commercial frenzy. The city had recently surpassed Louisville in cotton exports, and its position along the Mississippi made it the beating heart of the slave trade in the Western Territories. Auction houses lined Front Street like monuments to prosperity, their white columns gleaming in the southern sun, their interior halls echoing with the mechanical recitation of prices and the shuffling of human cargo. Among the city's elite, 3 families dominated the commercial landscape. The Harrington family controlled the largest cotton warehouses along the river. Edmund Harrington, patriarch and former Virginia aristocrat, had built his fortune through strategic marriages and ruthless business practices that left competitors bankrupt. His son Charles served as the family's public face, a handsome man of 32 who wore his privilege like a second skin, his every gesture calculated to remind others of their inferior station. The Dalton family, by contrast, had clawed their way up from modest circumstances. Jacob Dalton had arrived in Memphis 15 years earlier with nothing but a keen mind for numbers and an iron will. He'd established himself as the city's premier slave broker, the man who could procure any type of laborer a plantation owner might desire. His reputation for discretion made him indispensable to families who preferred their transactions to remain unrecorded in public ledgers. The third family, the Cavendish clan, represented old money from Charleston. Richard Cavendish had relocated to Memphis in 1847, bringing with him not only substantial capital, but also connections to shipping magnates in New Orleans and banking interests in New York. His wife, Victoria, hosted the most exclusive salons in the city, gatherings where business deals were sealed over imported wine and political alliances forged behind closed doors. These 3 families existed in a state of polite competition, their rivalries carefully masked by social niceties, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Each family sought advantage over the others, each searched for the investment or acquisition that would cement their dominance. It was into this environment that rumors began circulating in early November 1851. A slave trader named Ambrose Fletcher, known for operating in the Carolinas and Georgia, had arrived in Memphis with an unusual acquisition. Fletcher was not well liked among his peers. He worked alone, avoided the established auction houses, and had a reputation for dealing in what other traders called specialty merchandise, slaves with particular skills or attributes that commanded premium prices from very specific buyers. Fletcher took rooms at a modest boarding house on Madison Avenue, far from the grand hotels where visiting merchants typically stayed. He made no attempt to advertise his wares, conducted no business at the public auction houses, and spoke to no one about what he'd brought to Memphis. This silence itself became the story. In a trade built on publicity and competitive bidding, Fletcher's discretion suggested something extraordinary. The whispers started in the gentlemen's clubs. A slave of remarkable appearance. Not merely handsome, but possessing a beauty so striking that grown men stumbled over their words attempting to describe it. The rumors took on an almost mythical quality. Talk of features that seemed carved from marble, eyes that held an unsettling intelligence, a bearing that suggested nobility rather than bondage. Charles Harrington first heard about Fletcher's acquisition during a card game at the Memphis club. The man who mentioned it, a tobacco merchant named William Drexler, had apparently glimpsed the slave during a brief encounter on the street. Drexler described walking past Fletcher and his charge near the riverfront, and finding himself so arrested by the slave's appearance that he'd actually stopped walking, causing the man behind him to collide with his back. "I've been in this business 20 years, Drexler had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen thousands upon thousands. Nothing prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. It wasn't just the face, Harrington. It was something else, something in the way he moved, the way he held himself despite the chains. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't." Charles dismissed the story as exaggeration, the kind of tall tale men told after too much bourbon. But the description nagged at him. His father had recently expressed frustration with their household staff, complaining that none possessed the refinement appropriate to their social station. A slave of exceptional appearance, properly trained, could serve as a status symbol in the Harrington home, a conversation piece at dinner parties, a visible marker of the family's ability to acquire what others could not. Charles made inquiries. He learned that Fletcher was preparing to leave Memphis within the week, having apparently found no buyers interested in his unusual merchandise. The price being quoted, $3,000, was astronomical. A prime field hand rarely exceeded $1,500. An educated house slave might command $2,000. $3,000 suggested either madness or something genuinely exceptional. On a gray afternoon in late November, Charles Harrington arranged a private viewing. Fletcher received him in his boarding house room, a cramped space that smelled of lamp oil and river damp. The trader was a thin man in his 50s with the weathered skin of someone who'd spent decades traveling rough roads. His eyes held a calculating intelligence that Charles found immediately unsettling. "I appreciate discretion, Mr. Harrington," Fletcher said, gesturing to a chair. "Your inquiry came through appropriate channels. That speaks well of you." "I'm told you have something unusual," Charles replied, maintaining a businesslike tone despite his growing curiosity. "I'm here to determine if the rumors justify the price." Fletcher smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The price is non-negotiable. I should make that clear from the outset. What I have is unique. I will not bargain, nor will I accept promises of future payment. $3,000, gold or bank draft, no exceptions. Then perhaps you should show me what justifies such confidence." Fletcher walked to an adjoining door and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door opened, and Charles Harrington encountered the slave who would change his life. The young man who entered the room stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with a slender but well-proportioned build. His skin held the color of honey touched by sunlight, suggesting mixed heritage, a common enough circumstance in the slave trade, though the specific combination of features here created something Charles had never witnessed. The face possessed a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes of an unusual gray-green that seemed to shift color in the lamplight. But it was more than mere physical beauty. The young man moved with a fluid grace that suggested education, training, something far removed from the brutal world that had shaped most slaves. He wore simple clothes, cotton trousers and a white shirt, both clean but well worn. No chains, Charles noticed, no visible marks of restraint. The young man stood quietly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze directed at the floor in the expected posture of submission. Yet something in his bearing suggested the submission was performed rather than genuine, a role being played for an audience. "His name is Marcus," Fletcher said quietly. 23 years old, born in Virginia, educated in a manner I'm not at liberty to discuss. He reads and writes fluently in English and French. He has training in household management, bookkeeping, and music. He has never worked in the fields, never been subjected to harsh labor. His skin is unmarked, his health excellent. Charles circled the young man slowly, examining him as he would a piece of sculpture. Marcus remained motionless, his eyes still downcast, but Charles felt an almost electric awareness emanating from him, as though every nerve in the slave's body tracked his movement. "Let me see your hands," Charles said. Marcus raised his hands, palms up. The fingers were long and uncalloused, the nails neatly trimmed. Definitely not a field worker. The hands of someone who'd handled delicate objects, perhaps musical instruments or fine papers. "Look at me," Charles commanded. Marcus raised his eyes, and Charles felt a strange jolt of recognition, though he'd never seen this person before in his life. The eyes held intelligence, certainly, but also something else. A wariness, perhaps, or calculation. For just a moment, Charles had the unsettling feeling that he was being evaluated rather than evaluating. "Why hasn't he sold?" Charles asked Fletcher, breaking his gaze away from the slave. "If he's everything you claim, why are you still in Memphis? Someone should have snapped him up immediately." Fletcher's expression darkened slightly. "The men in this city lack vision. They see a pretty face and assume he's been kept as a pleasure slave, that he's damaged goods. They're wrong, but their prejudice has worked in your favor. You'll have the opportunity they were too foolish to take. What's his history? I need to know what I'm buying." "His history is complicated. He was raised in a household that valued education, employed for years as a personal secretary. The family fell into financial difficulty and was forced to liquidate assets. I acquired him legitimately, with proper documentation. Everything is legal and transferable." Something in Fletcher's tone suggested there was more to the story, details being deliberately omitted. Charles considered pressing the matter, but his mind was already racing ahead. The Dalton family had recently acquired a pair of twin house slaves, sisters who served as an exotic curiosity at their dinner parties. The Cavendish family employed a slave who could play piano and serve as entertainment during their famous salons. But this was something entirely different. A male slave of such striking appearance and obvious refinement would make Charles the envy of Memphis society. "I'll need documentation," Charles said. "Proof of ownership, transfer papers, everything legally required." "Of course. Everything is prepared. The question is whether you're prepared to meet my price." Charles studied Marcus one more time. The young man had returned his gaze to the floor, his posture unchanged, yet Charles sensed a tension in him as though he were a coiled spring waiting for release. What thoughts moved behind those unusual eyes? What did he think of this transaction? Of being examined like livestock? The question surprised Charles. He'd bought and sold dozens of slaves over the years and never once considered their interior lives. $3,000, Charles said finally. "I'll have the bank draft prepared. We'll complete the transaction tomorrow at my attorney's office." Fletcher nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Tomorrow then, 2:00. Bring the draft and I'll bring the papers. Mr. Harrington, you've made an excellent decision. Marcus will serve you well." As Charles left the boarding house, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. He'd just committed to the largest single purchase he'd ever made without his father's consultation. Edmund Harrington would be furious at first, but once he saw Marcus, once he understood the social advantage this acquisition represented, his anger would transform into approval. Charles was certain of it. What Charles could not know, as he walked back through the darkening streets of Memphis, was that he'd just set in motion a sequence of events that would destroy not only his own family but two others as well. The slave he'd agreed to purchase carried with him a mystery that would prove far more dangerous than beauty. The transfer of ownership took place exactly as arranged. Charles arrived at his attorney's office with a bank draft for $3,000 drawn on the Memphis Trust Bank. Fletcher produced documentation that appeared at first glance entirely legitimate. A bill of sale from a Virginia estate, transfer papers showing Fletcher's acquisition, and a letter attesting to Marcus's skills and character, signed by someone identified as Mrs. Eleanor Stratton of Richmond. The attorney, a cautious man named Horace Pembroke, examined everything carefully. He'd handled slave transactions for the Harrington family for years and prided himself on thorough documentation. Yet even he seemed slightly unnerved by Fletcher's intense scrutiny as the papers were reviewed. "Everything appears in order," Pembroke finally announced. "The provenance is clear, the documentation legally sufficient. Mr. Harrington, once you sign here, Marcus becomes your legal property." Charles signed without hesitation. Fletcher signed opposite. Money and papers changed hands. Marcus, who had stood silently throughout the entire proceeding, showed no visible reaction to his change in ownership. His face remained carefully neutral, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, his breathing slow and steady. "One piece of advice," Fletcher said as he prepared to leave, his hand on the door handle. "Marcus requires careful handling. He's not like other slaves. Treat him poorly and you'll find him difficult. Treat him with a measure of respect. Not as an equal, you understand, but with acknowledgement of his capabilities, and he'll exceed your expectations." "I know how to manage my property," Charles replied somewhat stiffly. "Of course, I'm sure you do." Fletcher tipped his hat and departed, leaving Memphis that same afternoon on a riverboat bound for New Orleans. He would never return to the city, and attempts to contact him in subsequent months would prove fruitless. Ambrose Fletcher, it seemed, had simply vanished from the slave trade entirely. Charles brought Marcus to the Harrington estate that evening. The family's home stood on Union Avenue, a grand Greek Revival mansion with 6 white columns supporting a broad front portico. The house had been designed to intimidate, to announce the family's wealth and status before visitors even crossed the threshold. Edmund Harrington had spared no expense on the furnishings. Imported carpets, crystal chandeliers from France, furniture crafted by master carpenters in Philadelphia. Edmund's reaction to Marcus proved even more dramatic than Charles had anticipated. The elder Harrington, prepared to rage at his son's impulsive expenditure, found himself speechless when Marcus was presented to him in the main parlor. Edmund circled the young man just as Charles had done the day before, his expression shifting from anger to fascination to something approaching unease. "Extraordinary," Edmund murmured. "Charles, you may have actually demonstrated business sense for once in your life. I've never seen anything quite like this." Charles felt a surge of pride. "I thought he could serve as your personal secretary. Handle correspondence, manage your calendar, serve at dinner parties. Imagine the impression he'll make on our guests." "Indeed." Edmund turned to Marcus. "Can you read complex documents, legal papers, financial statements?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice cultured and unexpectedly resonant. "I've handled such materials extensively in previous service." "We'll put that to the test tomorrow. Charles, have him quartered in the East Wing, the room adjacent to my study. I want him readily available." The decision to place Marcus in such proximity to the family's private quarters raised eyebrows among the household staff. The Harringtons employed 16 slaves, kitchen workers, field hands for their property outside the city, house servants, and a coachman. All were quartered either in the basement or in separate buildings behind the main house. To give this newcomer a room in the East Wing, mere feet from Edmund's personal study and just down the hall from Charles's own bedroom, suggested a status unlike anything the other slaves had experienced. The head housekeeper, an older woman named Bess, who'd served the Harrington family for 20 years, expressed her concerns to Charles that first evening. "It ain't right," she said bluntly. "Putting him up there with the family. The others are already talking. They don't know what to make of him." "He's not like the others," Charles replied. "He's educated, refined. Father wants him close for business purposes." Bess shook her head but said nothing more. She'd learned long ago that objecting too strenuously to the Harringtons' decisions led nowhere good. Marcus adapted to the household with remarkable speed. Within days, he'd mastered Edmund's schedule, organized years of disorganized correspondence, and demonstrated an ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced. He moved through the house with quiet efficiency, always present when needed but never intrusive. At dinner parties he served with a grace that made other servants appear clumsy by comparison, and guests invariably commented on his appearance. "Where on earth did you find him?" Mrs. Sarah Dalton asked during a dinner party 2 weeks after Marcus's arrival. She'd been unable to take her eyes off the young man since entering the house. "He's absolutely magnificent." "A fortunate acquisition," Edmund replied, clearly pleased by her reaction. "One must know where to look for quality." Victoria Cavendish, seated across the table, watched Marcus with narrowed eyes. "He seems almost too refined for bondage. One might mistake him for a gentleman, given proper clothes." "Appearances can be cultivated," Edmund said smoothly. "Training and education produce remarkable results when applied to suitable material." But privately, Edmund shared some of Victoria's unease. Marcus's refinement seemed innate rather than trained. His movements, his speech patterns, even the way he held a book when reading, all suggested someone raised with privilege rather than someone taught to mimic it. Where had Fletcher truly acquired him? Who was Mrs. Eleanor Stratton of Richmond, and why would such a person have owned a slave like Marcus? Edmund began making discreet inquiries. He wrote to contacts in Richmond, asking about the Stratton family and any recent slave sales from Virginia estates. The responses, when they came weeks later, only deepened the mystery. No one knew of a Mrs. Eleanor Stratton. The signature on Marcus's documentation appeared to be genuine, the handwriting consistent throughout multiple documents, but the person herself seemed not to exist in Richmond's social registry. Meanwhile, Charles found himself increasingly fascinated by Marcus in ways that troubled him. It wasn't merely the young man's appearance, though. That remained startling no matter how many times Charles saw him. It was the sense of intelligence behind those grey-green eyes, the feeling that Marcus observed and understood far more than he revealed. Charles began creating excuses to interact with him, asking questions about his past that Marcus answered with careful vagueness. "Where did you learn French?" Charles asked one afternoon, having discovered Marcus reading a French novel in his room. "My previous employer valued languages," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. "I was taught as a child." "That's unusual. Most slaveholders don't bother educating their property so extensively." "My situation was unusual." "In what way?" Marcus hesitated, a flicker of something, pain, anger, crossing his face before his expression returned to its usual careful neutrality. "Perhaps it's better left in the past, Mr. Harrington." But Charles couldn't leave it in the past. He found himself thinking about Marcus at odd hours, wondering about the life that had shaped such a person. Had he known freedom? Had he been torn from some better circumstance? The questions felt dangerous, implying a humanity in Marcus that Charles had been raised to deny in slaves. The other household slaves maintained a cautious distance from Marcus. They recognized his elevated status, but also sensed something unsettling about him. Bess confided to the cook that Marcus made her nervous. "He watches everything," she said. "Sees everything. Never says much, but you can tell he's thinking. I swear sometimes I catch him looking at Mr. Edmund or Mr. Charles with something in his eyes. I don't know. Something that ain't fear, that's for certain." The cook, a woman named Judith, nodded agreement. "That man's got secrets. Mark my words. Secrets we probably don't want to know." They were more correct than they realized. On a cold evening in early January 1852, approximately 6 weeks after Marcus's arrival, Jacob Dalton paid an unexpected visit to the Harrington estate. He arrived without prior notice, his carriage pulling up to the front portico just as the family finished dinner. Edmund received him in his study, curious about what would prompt such an unusual call. Dalton was a stout man with a red face and intense eyes that suggested either brilliance or madness, depending on context. He entered the study in an agitated state, declining Edmund's offer of brandy and getting straight to the point. "I want to buy your new slave," Dalton announced without preamble. "The young man, Marcus. Name your price." Edmund blinked in surprise. "He's not for sale, Jacob. I just acquired him." "I'll give you $5,000. That's nearly double what you paid." "How do you even know what I paid?" Dalton waved his hand dismissively. "I make it my business to know these things. $5,000, Edmund. Think about it. That's an extraordinary profit for 6 weeks of ownership." "The answer is no. Marcus has proven invaluable to my business operations. He's far more useful than $5,000. Dalton's face reddened further. "6,000 then. That's my final offer." "Jacob, even if I were inclined to sell, which I'm not, why on earth would you pay such an absurd price? What possible use could he be to you that would justify such an expenditure?" For a long moment, Dalton stared at Edmund without speaking. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "You don't understand what you have in your house, do you? You think he's just an unusually handsome slave with some education. But there's something else about him. Something that could be valuable in the right circumstances." "What are you talking about?" "I've made inquiries about the man who sold him to you, Ambrose Fletcher. Do you know what Fletcher specialized in, Edmund? He didn't trade in regular field hands or even educated house slaves. He dealt in slaves with very specific attributes, sold to very specific buyers. Private collectors, shall we say. People willing to pay extraordinary sums for extraordinary merchandise." Edmund felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Fletcher disappeared from Memphis immediately after your purchase. No forwarding address, no trace of where he went. That's suspicious, don't you think? And the documentation he provided? Have you verified it? Actually traced it back to its supposed source? The papers were examined by my attorney. Papers can be forged, signatures can be copied. I'm willing to bet that if you investigate thoroughly, you'll find inconsistencies, questions without answers." Edmund's unease deepened. "Even if that were true, it doesn't explain your interest in buying Marcus. What do you know that I don't?" Dalton leaned forward, his voice dropping to near whisper. 3 days ago, Richard Cavendish approached me with a proposition. He wanted to know if I could arrange to steal Marcus from your household. He offered me $2,000 just to facilitate the theft, with the promise of another $3,000 once the slave was safely in his possession. I turned him down, of course. I'm a businessman, not a thief. But it tells you something, doesn't it? About what Cavendish thinks that young man is worth. Edmund sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Why would Richard want him so badly? That's what I've been trying to determine. I've asked questions, made inquiries through my network, and I've learned some very interesting things, Edmund. Things that suggest Marcus might not even be who Fletcher claimed he was. Explain. There are rumors, just whispers, mind you, nothing confirmed, that a certain family in Virginia lost a son about 2 years ago. The son disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The family claimed he'd run away, but there were irregularities in their story. This young man was educated, cultured, known for his striking appearance. The family is not discussing what happened, which is itself interesting. They've refused all inquiries, even from journalists. But here's what makes it truly intriguing. The family's name was Thornton. Eleanor Thornton was the mother, not Stratton, Thornton. The similarity in names struck Edmund immediately. A simple change of a few letters. Exactly. Now I can't prove Marcus is the missing Thornton son. I can't even prove such a son existed. The family has been remarkably effective at suppressing information. But if he were, Edmund, if Marcus is actually a free-born man who was illegally enslaved, do you understand what that would mean? Edmund understood perfectly. It would mean that Marcus's enslavement was not only illegal but criminal. It would mean that Fletcher had trafficked in kidnapped free people. And it would mean that Edmund had unknowingly participated in that crime by purchasing him. The legal ramifications would be catastrophic. The social consequences even worse. The Harrington name would be destroyed. "This is speculation," Edmund said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "You have no proof. I have enough to make both Richard Cavendish and myself willing to pay extraordinary sums to acquire Marcus. Enough to make me travel here on a cold January evening to make you an offer. Think about it, Edmund. $6,000. Take the money. Let me handle whatever complications might arise from Marcus's past, and you wash your hands of the entire matter." Edmund studied Dalton carefully. The man was a skilled negotiator, expert at reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. Was this elaborate story simply a tactic to acquire Marcus at a profit? Or was there genuine substance to these claims about the Thornton family? "I need time to consider this," Edmund said finally. "Give me 3 days to investigate your claims. If I find evidence supporting what you've suggested, we'll discuss terms." Dalton stood, clearly unhappy with this response, but recognizing he'd pushed as far as he could. 3 days, Edmund. But I warn you, Cavendish won't wait forever. If he can't buy Marcus legally, he might resort to other methods. After Dalton departed, Edmund sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at the fire burning in the hearth. His mind churned with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Finally, he rang for Marcus. The young man appeared within minutes, his expression composed and attentive. "You called for me, sir?" Edmund studied him with new eyes, searching for any hint of deception or hidden identity. Marcus bore the scrutiny calmly, neither defiant nor submissive, simply waiting. "Tell me the truth," Edmund said quietly. "Who are you really? Not the history Fletcher provided. The truth." Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise, perhaps, or relief. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality Edmund had come to expect. "What truth would you like to hear, Mr. Harrington?" Marcus asked softly. "The truth of what I was, or the truth of what I've become?" "Both." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight it hadn't held before, as though he were finally allowing something genuine to emerge. "I was born free. In Virginia, as Fletcher's papers claim. I received an education appropriate to my station. I had prospects, a future. Then circumstances changed in ways I couldn't control, and I found myself in a situation no amount of education or refinement could rescue me from. Fletcher purchased me from people who had no legal right to sell me. He knew this. He didn't care. He saw an opportunity to profit from someone else's tragedy, and he took it. The Thornton family," Edmund said. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "You've been making inquiries. Jacob Dalton was just here. He told me things. Are you Eleanor Thornton's son?" "I was." The simple past tense of that statement carried enormous weight. Edmund felt his world tilting. He'd spent $3,000 on a free-born man, had enslaved someone illegally, had committed a crime that could destroy his entire family. "Why didn't you say anything?" Edmund demanded, anger rising. "Why didn't you protest when Fletcher sold you to me? Why didn't you speak up at the attorney's office?" Marcus's expression hardened. "And say what, exactly? Who would have believed me? A man in chains claiming to be freeborn? Fletcher had documents, signatures, seemingly legitimate papers. I had nothing but my word. Would your attorney have sided with me over Fletcher's documentation? Would you have?" Edmund had no answer. Marcus was right. No one would have believed him. The word of a claimed slave against documented proof of ownership. The law would have sided with the documentation every time. "If you're free-born," Edmund said slowly, "then you have rights. I should arrange your release. Return you to your family. My family is the reason I'm in this situation." Marcus said bitterly, "Do you think I was kidnapped off the street like some common victim?" "My own mother sold me, Mr. Harrington. She manufactured the documentation, created the false history, and sold me to Fletcher to pay off family debts. The Thornton name was more valuable to her than her own son. So forgive me if I don't share your optimism about the possibility of returning home." The revelation stunned Edmund. He'd heard of such things, desperate families selling their mixed-race children, hoping to pass them off as slaves to discharge debts, but always as distant rumors, never as immediate reality. "Why are you telling me this now?" Edmund asked. "Because Dalton is right to warn you about Cavendish. Richard Cavendish knows who I am. He knows what I represent. And he wants me not as a slave, but as leverage against my family. The Thorntons may have disowned me, but they still fear exposure. Cavendish has been trying to blackmail them for months. If he acquires me, he'll use me to extract far more than $6,000 from my mother. He'll bleed the Thornton fortune dry, then expose the scandal anyway just for the pleasure of destroying them." Edmund's mind reeled. "How do you know this?" "Because I'm not deaf, Mr. Harrington. I hear conversations in this house. I observe who visits and why. I've pieced together information from fragments of overheard discussions. Cavendish has been planning this for some time. Dalton's offer tonight wasn't generosity. It was an attempt to outmaneuver Cavendish before Cavendish makes his move." "Then what should I do?" Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That depends on what kind of man you are. You could sell me to Dalton and profit handsomely. You could sell me to Cavendish and profit even more, though at greater moral cost. Or you could do something neither man expects." "Which is?" "You could help me disappear." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Edmund stared at Marcus, seeing not a slave, but a young man trapped by circumstances beyond his control, yet still fighting to survive with whatever tools remained to him. "If I help you," Edmund said slowly, "I'll make enemies of both Dalton and Cavendish. They won't forgive what they'll see as betrayal. No, they won't. But if you sell me to either of them, you'll never know a moment's peace. The truth will come out eventually. It always does. And when it does, you'll be implicated in a scandal that will destroy your family's reputation just as surely as it would destroy mine. At least if I disappear, you can claim ignorance, say I ran away, that you were as deceived by Fletcher as anyone else." Edmund considered the options before him. Each path led to risk. Each choice carried consequences. But Marcus was right about one thing. The truth had a way of emerging, no matter how deeply buried. Better to act now, while he still had some control over the situation, than to wait for disaster to arrive on his doorstep. 3 days, Edmund said finally. "That's what I told Dalton. In 3 days, you'll disappear. I'll provide money and documentation to help you reach the north. In return, you'll never contact me again, never reveal what you know about this family, never speak of your time in this house." "Agreed. And Marcus, or whatever your real name is. Marcus is my real name. Marcus Thornton. Whatever else was taken from me, they couldn't take that. Marcus, then. If I discover you've betrayed this confidence, if you try to use what you know against me, I'll spend every resource I have hunting you down. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly." They shook hands, master and slave, making a deal that upended everything such a relationship was supposed to represent. Edmund felt the firmness of Marcus's grip, the equal strength meeting his own, and realized this was perhaps the first truly honest interaction they'd had since Marcus arrived in his household. Neither man could have predicted how this agreement would lead not to Marcus's disappearance, but to something far more catastrophic. Because there were others watching, others with their own plans, and the next 3 days would prove that in Memphis in 1852, keeping secrets was far more difficult than either of them imagined. The following morning, Charles Harrington noticed an immediate change in his father's demeanor. Edmund was distracted during breakfast, barely touching his food, his eyes constantly drifting toward the doorway as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. When Charles asked if something was wrong, Edmund simply shook his head and muttered something about business concerns. Marcus served at the table as always, his movements efficient and unremarkable. To Charles's eye, nothing seemed different about the young man, yet there was something, a tension in the air, a feeling that the ordinary surface of their morning routine concealed currents Charles couldn't quite identify. After breakfast, Edmund called Charles into his study and closed the door, an unusual precaution in their own home. "What do you know about Richard Cavendish's financial situation?" Edmund asked without preamble. Charles frowned at the unexpected question. The Cavendish family? They're wealthy, obviously. Old Charleston money, shipping interests. Why? Has Cavendish approached you recently? Made any unusual offers or inquiries? No, father, what's this about? Edmund paced to the window, staring out at the front grounds. Last night, Jacob Dalton came here with an extraordinary offer. He wanted to buy Marcus for $6,000. When I refused, he told me Richard Cavendish had approached him about stealing Marcus. Offered $5,000 total to facilitate the theft. Charles felt his stomach tighten. Stealing him. Why would Cavendish want him that badly? That's what we need to determine. I want you to make inquiries, discreetly. Find out what you can about Cavendish's recent activities, who he's been meeting with, whether he's had financial troubles, any information that might explain his behavior. Can you do that? Of course. But father, shouldn't we simply ask Marcus? If someone wants to steal him, surely he deserves to know. Edmund turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Marcus knows more than enough already. Just get me the information, Charles. We don't have much time. Charles left the study confused and increasingly worried. His father's behavior suggested something far more serious than a simple business rivalry. And the mention of time running out, what deadline were they facing? He spent the day making careful inquiries among his social circle, gradually piecing together information about Richard Cavendish's recent activities. What emerged was troubling. Cavendish, it seemed, had been spending well beyond his apparent means for the past year. He'd purchased property in New Orleans, invested heavily in a steamboat venture that subsequently failed, and been seen gambling at the Memphis club with stakes that suggested either great wealth or great desperation. His wife, Victoria, had curtailed her famous salons, citing health concerns, though rumors suggested the real reason was financial embarrassment. More intriguingly, Cavendish had been making frequent trips to Virginia and back over the past several months. The purpose of these trips remained unclear, but one of Charles's contacts mentioned seeing Cavendish in Richmond in November, just weeks before Marcus arrived in Memphis. Charles reported his findings to Edmund that evening. His father listened intently, occasionally nodding as pieces of a puzzle apparently fell into place. Richmond in November, Edmund murmured. That's interesting. Why? What does it mean? It means Cavendish may have known about Marcus before I even purchased him. He may have been in Virginia investigating Marcus's background, learning about the Thornton family. What Thornton family? Father, you're not making sense. Edmund hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, Marcus isn't who Fletcher claimed he was. His real name is Marcus Thornton. He was born free in Virginia, illegally enslaved by his own family to pay debts, and sold through Fletcher to me. If that information became public, it would create a scandal that could destroy multiple families, including ours. Charles sat down heavily, stunned by this revelation. How long have you known this? Since last night. Marcus told me after Dalton left. And now Cavendish is circling like a vulture, trying to acquire Marcus for reasons that likely have nothing to do with household service, and everything to do with blackmail or extortion. What are we going to do? I've made arrangements with Marcus. In 2 more days he'll disappear. We'll claim he ran away. Neither Dalton nor Cavendish will be able to acquire him, and we'll be free of this entire situation. Charles should have felt relief at this plan. Instead, he felt an unexpected sense of loss. Despite the complications Marcus represented, despite the danger his presence brought, Charles had grown accustomed to having him in the house. More than accustomed, he'd found himself looking forward to their brief interactions, to the moments when Marcus's careful facade slipped and revealed glimpses of the intelligent, complex person beneath. "Does Marcus want to disappear?" Charles asked quietly. Edmund looked at him sharply. "What he wants is irrelevant. This is the only solution that protects everyone involved. It protects us. I'm not sure it protects him. Where will he go? How will he survive as a fugitive slave? If he's caught, he won't be caught. I'm providing him with documentation and funds. He's clever enough to make his way north. Now stop questioning my decisions and focus on helping me ensure the next 2 days pass without incident. But incident was precisely what the next 2 days would bring. Because while Edmund and Charles planned Marcus's disappearance, Richard Cavendish was implementing plans of his own. Plans that had been months in the making and would soon erupt into violence that would shock Memphis society. That night, a fire broke out in the Cavendish family warehouse near the riverfront. The blaze consumed the building entirely, destroying an estimated $50,000 worth of goods. Cavendish himself had been inside when the fire started, attempting to salvage account books. He escaped with his life, but suffered burns to his hands and face. The fire was ruled accidental, blamed on a knocked-over lamp. But those who knew Cavendish's financial situation whispered different theories. Some suggested he'd set the fire himself to collect insurance money. Others claimed the blaze had been started by creditors sending a message. The truth was darker than either theory. The fire had been started deliberately, but not by Cavendish and not for insurance purposes. Someone wanted Cavendish distracted, wanted his attention focused away from his plans for Marcus Thornton. Someone who understood that desperate men make mistakes, and that those mistakes could be exploited. The following morning, while Cavendish recovered from his injuries, 3 events occurred in rapid succession that would shatter the fragile equilibrium Edmund had tried to maintain. First, Jacob Dalton's eldest son, Thomas, was found dead in his room at the family home. The young man, just 24 years old, appeared to have died from some kind of seizure or apoplexy, though no doctor could determine the exact cause. His body showed no signs of trauma, no indication of poison, nothing that explained why a healthy young man would simply stop breathing in the middle of the night. Second, Victoria Cavendish arrived at the Harrington estate, demanding to see Marcus. She was ushered into the front parlor, where she paced like a caged animal, her usual social grace entirely abandoned. When Edmund arrived to receive her, she dispensed with all pleasantries. "I know what you're planning," she said without preamble. "You're going to help him escape. Don't bother denying it. Richard had someone watching your house. We know about the late-night conversation with your son, the quiet preparations. You think you can spirit him away before we can act. Mrs. Cavendish, I don't know what your husband told you, but don't patronize me, Edmund. I know exactly what Marcus Thornton represents. I know what my husband intended to do with him, and I know what you stand to lose if certain information becomes public. So let me make this very simple. Give Marcus to me. Right now, I'll pay you $4,000 more than you paid Fletcher. In return, you'll never hear about this situation again. Your husband tried to have him stolen. Why should I trust any Cavendish offer?" Victoria's expression hardened. Richard's warehouse burning was no accident. Someone wanted to prevent him from taking action. Someone who understood that with Marcus's help, Richard could have extracted enough money from the Thornton family to resolve all our financial difficulties. Now my husband lies injured, his business destroyed, and I'm left to salvage what I can. Give me Marcus, and I promise you on my family's name that whatever secrets he carries die with him." The implied threat in that last phrase was unmistakable. Edmund felt ice in his veins. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing. I'm simply stating facts. Some problems can only be solved permanently. Some loose ends can only be cut, not tied. Now, will you accept my offer?" Before Edmund could respond, Charles burst into the parlor, his face pale. "Father, you need to come quickly." "It's Marcus. He's gone." Edmund and Victoria rushed to follow Charles through the house. They found Marcus's room empty, the bed made, no sign of struggle or hurried departure. Everything was in order, except for one detail. Marcus himself had vanished. "When did you last see him?" Edmund demanded. "Less than an hour ago," Charles replied. "He served breakfast, then came upstairs. I assumed he was in his room preparing for the day, but when I went to find him, he was simply gone." Edmund's mind raced. Had Marcus decided not to wait for their planned escape? Had he overheard Victoria's visit and fled in fear? Or had something else happened, something none of them had anticipated? Victoria's expression had transformed from anger to calculation. He can't have gone far. Not in broad daylight, not without preparation. Search the grounds. Check with your other slaves, see if anyone saw anything. Don't tell me what to do in my own house, Edmund snapped. Then do it yourself. That young man represents a fortune to whoever finds him first. Do you really want it to be someone other than us? The third event that morning emerged from that search. One of the stable hands, when questioned, reported seeing a carriage arrive at the back entrance of the estate just after dawn. He'd thought it was a delivery, hadn't paid much attention, but now that he considered it more carefully, the carriage had the markings of the Dalton family, a distinctive blue stripe along the side panels. Dalton, Edmund breathed. That bastard didn't wait for my answer. He took him. But Edmund was wrong. Jacob Dalton had not taken Marcus. Jacob Dalton at that very moment was arranging his son's funeral, too grief-stricken to think about business or schemes. The carriage the stable hand had seen did belong to the Dalton family, but it had been hired by someone else, someone who'd been maneuvering behind all the competing interests, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The person who had taken Marcus understood something none of the others did, that the young man's value wasn't in his appearance or his potential for blackmail. His value lay in what he knew, what he'd observed during his weeks in the Harrington household, and what he could reveal about the interconnected scandals that linked three of Memphis's most powerful families. By the time Edmund, Charles, and Victoria realized Marcus hadn't simply run away, that he'd been deliberately taken by someone with a specific agenda, he was already 10 miles outside Memphis, bound for a destination none of them could have predicted. The disappearance of Marcus Thornton triggered a chain reaction through Memphis's elite society that would later be described in hushed tones as the darkest scandal the city had ever witnessed. But that understanding would only come later. In the immediate aftermath of his vanishing, confusion reigned. Edmund Harrington's first instinct was to contact the authorities and report a runaway slave. But Victoria Cavendish's icy stare stopped him before he could send for the sheriff. "Think carefully," she said. "Once you involve the law, everything becomes public record. Questions will be asked about Marcus's background, his purchase, Fletcher's documentation. Is that really what you want?" Edmund hesitated. She was right. Official involvement meant official scrutiny, and scrutiny would expose the irregularities in Marcus's acquisition. Better to handle this privately, through channels that wouldn't create permanent records. "Then what do you suggest?" Edmund asked. "We pool our resources. You, my family, and the Daltons. We all have reasons to want Marcus found. We hire private investigators, slave catchers if necessary. We find him before anyone else does, and then we resolve the situation." Charles, listening to this exchange, felt his unease deepen. Resolve how exactly? Victoria turned her cold gaze on him. "However necessary, Mr. Harrington. This is not a time for squeamishness." Over the next 2 days, a private search was organized. Edmund contacted Jacob Dalton, who, despite his grief over Thomas's death, recognized the urgency of the situation. The two men, along with Richard Cavendish, still recovering from his burns but determined to be involved, pooled resources and hired a notorious slave catcher named Silas Ketch, a man known for his success in recovering runaways and his complete lack of scruples about methods. Ketch listened to their descriptions of Marcus with interest that seemed more than professional. When shown a daguerreotype that Charles had commissioned weeks earlier, a portrait of Marcus that Charles had claimed was for household records, Ketch studied it intently. "Unusual face," Ketch observed, "the kind people remember. That'll make finding him easier, assuming he's still in the area. But gentlemen, I have to ask, is there anything else I should know about this particular slave? Anything that might affect how I conduct the search?" The three men exchanged glances. Finally, Cavendish spoke. "He's valuable, very valuable, worth far more than his purchase price. We need him returned unharmed and with discretion regarding his whereabouts during his absence." Ketch's eyes narrowed. Discretion cost extra, and if this boy is as valuable as you say, I'll need guarantees about payment. Say, $2,000 on delivery? $1,000, Edmund countered. Plus expenses. $1,500 and we have a deal. They agreed to Ketch's terms. The slave catcher departed to begin his work, leaving the three families to wait and worry. But even as Ketch began his search, other forces were moving in Memphis, forces none of them understood. Thomas Dalton's sudden death was followed, 2 days later, by another unexpected fatality. One of Richard Cavendish's business partners, a cotton factor named William Drexler, the same man who'd first told Charles about Marcus's extraordinary appearance, collapsed during a business lunch. He died before a doctor could reach him, apparently from heart failure, though he'd been in perfect health that morning. 2 deaths in 4 days, both of young, healthy men connected to the Marcus Thornton situation. Some might call it coincidence. Others began to whisper about something darker. The whispers grew louder when Silas Ketch returned to Memphis 1 week after beginning his search. The slave catcher looked haggard, as though he'd aged years in days. He gathered the 3 men in Edmund Harrington's study and delivered a report that left them stunned. "I found your slave," Ketch said without preamble. "Or rather, I found where he'd been taken. There's a property about 15 miles northeast of here, an old plantation that was supposedly abandoned after the previous owner died, except it's not abandoned. Someone's been using it as a base of operations, and that someone has been watching all of you for months." "Watching us?" Cavendish demanded. "Who?" "That's where things get complicated. The person who took Marcus is a woman. I didn't get her name. She was gone before I could investigate thoroughly. But I found documents in that house, gentlemen. Letters, financial records, personal correspondence. Someone has been systematically documenting everything about your 3 families, your business dealings, your private affairs, your financial vulnerabilities. Everything." Edmund felt cold sweat break out across his back. "What kind of documents?" "Records of illegal slave purchases, evidence of falsified property transfers, details of bribery paid to city officials, documentation of business deals that violated federal trade laws. Gentlemen, whoever compiled this information has enough evidence to destroy all 3 of your families simultaneously." "Where's Marcus?" Dalton asked, his voice strangled. "Gone. They cleared out maybe 2 days before I arrived, but they left one thing behind. A message specifically addressed to the 3 of you." Ketch produced a sealed envelope from his coat. Edmund took it with shaking hands and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper with elegant handwriting. "Gentlemen, by now you've realized that Marcus Thornton is no longer within your reach. You've also realized that your private affairs are no longer private. I have documentation of crimes sufficient to see all 3 of you imprisoned, your families bankrupted, your names destroyed forever." You may wonder why I would gather such information. The answer is simple. You were all complicit in what happened to my son. Jacob Dalton, you sold him to Fletcher knowing full well the documentation was fraudulent. You didn't care that you were trafficking in a freeborn person because the profit was too attractive to refuse. Richard Cavendish, you tracked my son to Memphis intending to use him for blackmail. You planned to extract money from me under threat of exposing what I'd done, then expose the truth anyway, simply for the pleasure of destroying what remained of my family's reputation. Edmund Harrington, you purchased my son knowing something was wrong with the transaction, knowing the price was too high, knowing the documentation seemed suspicious. You didn't care because you wanted the status symbol he represented. All 3 of you saw a vulnerable young man and saw only opportunity. None of you saw a human being. None of you considered the damage you were doing. Now you will pay for that lack of consideration. I could destroy you all immediately. I could deliver my documentation to newspapers, to federal authorities, to anyone who would listen. But that would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice. Within the next 30 days, Each of you will receive instructions on how to make reparations for what you've done. These reparations will be substantial, financial, social, and personal. If you comply, I will return my documentation to you, and you will never hear from me again. If you refuse, or if you attempt to harm me or my son, everything I know becomes public. The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Eleanor Thornton. The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund read the letter twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. Marcus's mother, the woman who supposedly sold her own son into slavery, had somehow orchestrated all of this, had taken Marcus back, had been watching them for months, had gathered evidence of crimes they'd thought safely hidden. "It's a bluff," Cavendish said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "She can't possibly have the evidence she claims." "The slave catcher says otherwise," Dalton countered. "He saw the documents. Are you willing to gamble your entire family's future on the assumption she's lying?" "What I want to know," Edmund said quietly, "is how she did this. How did one woman orchestrate something so complex? The burned warehouse, the deaths, the timing of everything. It's too coordinated for one person." "She had help," Ketch said. "There were signs of multiple people using that property. I'd guess at least 3 or 4 individuals working together. One of them might have been Marcus himself, if he wasn't actually kidnapped, but went willingly once he realized his mother was trying to rescue him." The implication struck them all simultaneously. Marcus hadn't been a passive victim in any of this. He'd been gathering information from inside the Harrington household, observing their business dealings, learning their vulnerabilities, his seeming compliance, his perfect service. It had all been an act, a cover while he fed information to his mother. "That intelligent bastard," Edmund muttered, almost admiringly despite his fury. "He played us all from the beginning." "So what do we do?" Charles asked. He'd been silent throughout Ketch's report, his face growing paler with each revelation. Now he looked between the 3 older men searching for answers. "Do we comply with her demands?" "Absolutely not," Cavendish said immediately. "We don't negotiate with extortionists. We find her, we find Marcus, and we silence them both permanently." "And how do you propose we do that?" Edmund asked. "She's clearly anticipated every move we might make. She had an escape plan ready before Ketch even began his search. For all we know, she and Marcus are already in another state, beyond our reach. Then we hire people to track them down. People who specialize in this sort of thing. Men like that don't come cheap. And the more people we involve, the greater the chance that word of this situation leaks out. Every person we tell becomes a potential witness against us." They argued for over an hour. The 3 men who'd competed as rivals now forced into unwilling alliance by a threat none of them had anticipated. Eventually, exhaustion and fear drove them to a temporary decision. They would wait for Eleanor Thornton's instructions before taking action. They would see what she demanded, evaluate whether compliance was possible, and make their decisions then. But even as they agreed to this plan, each man was already contemplating alternatives. Each was already considering how to protect himself, even if it meant sacrificing the others. The alliance between them was fragile at best, held together only by mutual fear and the hope that somehow they could emerge from this disaster with their reputations intact. They would all be disappointed. Eleanor Thornton hadn't orchestrated months of careful planning only to accept their compliance with her demands. What she wanted wasn't money or social reparations. What she wanted was something far more devastating, something that would ensure these men could never again use their power to hurt others the way they'd hurt her son. She wanted their complete destruction. Eleanor Thornton's instructions arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered to each household by anonymous courier. The letters were identical in structure but personalized in their demands, each one designed to strike at the specific vulnerabilities of its recipient. Jacob Dalton received his letter first, delivered to his home on a grey morning still heavy with grief over Thomas's death. The instructions were precise. He was to write a detailed confession of his role in trafficking Marcus Thornton, acknowledging that he'd knowingly sold a freeborn man into slavery. This confession was to be notarized and delivered to an address in Nashville within 15 days. Additionally, he was to pay $15,000, the sum Eleanor calculated he'd earned from illegal slave transactions over the previous 5 years, into a fund for supporting formerly enslaved people seeking education and employment. If he complied, the evidence against him would be destroyed. If he refused, copies of his business ledgers would be sent to federal authorities, along with documentation that would reveal at least a dozen instances of illegal slave trading, any one of which carried a potential prison sentence. Dalton read the letter in his study, his hands trembling. The demands were impossible. A written confession would destroy him, even if the federal charges were avoided. His business, his reputation, his family's standing, all would be ruined. And $15,000 represented a significant portion of his liquid assets. Compliance would cripple him financially and socially, but non-compliance would see him in prison. He sat in his study for hours, the letter in front of him, weighing impossible choices. His wife found him there at noon, still motionless, staring at nothing. Richard Cavendish's demands were different but equally devastating. He was to sell his remaining business assets at fair market value and use the proceeds to establish a school for children of former slaves in Memphis. He was to write letters to 3 families he'd wronged through business dealings, apologizing and offering financial restitution. And he was to publicly withdraw from all social organizations that excluded people based on race or previous condition of servitude. The social suicide these actions represented would be absolute. Cavendish would become a pariah among his former peers, his reputation destroyed, his family's social standing obliterated. His wife, Victoria, upon reading the demands, flew into a rage that ended with her smashing a crystal vase against the fireplace. "We will not comply," she declared. "I don't care what evidence she claims to have. We will not be dictated to by a woman who sold her own son." "She didn't sell him," Richard said quietly. "That's what we didn't understand. She never sold Marcus. Someone else in her family did. Likely her husband or another relative trying to hide a scandal. She's been trying to get him back ever since. Then her complaint is with whoever actually sold him, not with us. We participated. We profited. In her eyes, that makes us equally guilty." Edmund Harrington's demands were perhaps the most personally devastating. He was to free all 16 of his slaves, providing each with documentation, travel funds, and assistance in establishing new lives as free people. He was to publicly acknowledge his role in purchasing Marcus Thornton, despite knowing the transaction was suspicious. And he was to resign from his position in 2 Memphis banks, where he served on the board, recommending they adopt policies against accepting slave-based collateral for loans. Charles found his father in the study late that evening, the letter clutched in his hand, tears streaming down his face. It was the first time Charles had ever seen Edmund Harrington cry. "It's over," Edmund said simply. "Everything we've built, everything our family represents. She's demanding we dismantle it all piece by piece. Then we fight," Charles said. "We hire lawyers, investigators. We find her before the 30 days expire. She's too smart for that. She's been planning this for months, maybe longer. Every move we might make she's already anticipated." "And Charles," Edmund looked up at his son with devastated eyes, "the worst part is that she's right. About all of it. We did participate in something monstrous. We did value property over humanity. We justified it by saying it was legal, it was accepted, it was just business. But that doesn't make it right." This was dangerous thinking, Charles realized. His father was accepting Eleanor's moral framework, which meant he was already halfway to compliance, and compliance would destroy their family as surely as exposure. "We need to meet," Charles said. "All 3 families. We need to present a united front, determine our response together." The meeting took place 2 days later, held at the Harrington estate after dark to avoid observation. Jacob Dalton arrived looking haggard, having apparently slept little since receiving his letter. Richard Cavendish appeared slightly better composed. though Victoria's presence indicated she'd taken control of their family's response. Edmund and Charles represented the Harrington interests. They gathered in Edmund's study, the five of them arranged in chairs around the fireplace like conspirators, which, Charles reflected grimly, they essentially were. "We need to find her," Victoria declared, taking command of the discussion. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes." This situation ends when Eleanor Thornton and her son are eliminated as threats. "You're talking about murder," Edmund said flatly. "I'm talking about survival. She's given us an impossible choice: destroy ourselves through compliance or be destroyed through exposure. I'm proposing a third option: remove her ability to destroy us." "And how do you propose we do that?" Dalton asked. "We don't know where she is. We don't know who's helping her. For all we know, she's already made copies of all her evidence and distributed them to trusted associates. Killing her might only accelerate our exposure. Then we need to find out. We need to hire people who can track her down and determine the full extent of her preparations before we take action." Charles listened to this discussion with growing horror. They were calmly debating murder as though it were a business strategy. He'd known his family's wealth was built on morally questionable foundations. That was simply the nature of their world. But this was different. This was planning violence against a woman whose only crime was trying to save her son. "There's another option," Charles said, interrupting Victoria's strategic planning. "We could comply with her demands." The other four stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Are you insane?" Victoria demanded. "Compliance destroys us just as surely as exposure." "Maybe that's appropriate," Charles said quietly. "Maybe we deserve to be destroyed." "Charles," Edmund began. "No, hear me out. Everything Eleanor Thornton accused us of is true. We did participate in trafficking a free-born man. We did value property over humanity. We did commit crimes in pursuit of profit. Maybe the appropriate response isn't to compound those crimes with more violence, but to accept responsibility for what we've done." "Noble sentiments," Cavendish said coldly, "but nobility doesn't feed your family or preserve your name. The real world requires pragmatism, not philosophical hand-wringing." "The real world is changing," Charles countered. "There's increasing pressure against slavery in the North, federal tensions over the Fugitive Slave Act. What happens in the next few years if the abolitionists gain more power? What happens if slavery itself becomes illegal? All the evidence Eleanor gathered would still exist, still be usable against us. Compliance at least ends this threat." "Your son makes a valid point," Dalton said thoughtfully. "The political landscape is shifting. Perhaps compliance, as devastating as it would be, is the safest long-term strategy." "Absolutely not," Victoria snapped. "We fight. We find her. We end this threat permanently." The meeting dissolved into argument, the temporary alliance fracturing under pressure. Eventually, with nothing resolved, the families departed to make their own decisions. The fragile unity that fear had created shattered, leaving each family to face Eleanor's demands alone. Over the next week, each family made their choice. Jacob Dalton, weakened by grief over Thomas's death and unable to face the prospect of prison, began preparing his confession. He liquidated assets, withdrew funds from his accounts, and set about complying with Eleanor's demands. The process would ruin him financially and socially, but at least he would remain free. Richard and Victoria Cavendish took the opposite approach. They hired private investigators, bounty hunters, and men whose skill sets included violence. They poured money into finding Eleanor Thornton, determined to eliminate the threat she represented before the 30-day deadline expired. Edmund and Charles Harrington found themselves caught between these extremes, unable to agree on a course of action. Edmund leaned toward compliance, his moral certainty shaken by recent events. Charles, despite his speech at the meeting, found himself torn between his father's guilt and a more practical recognition that compliance would destroy everything their family had built over generations. The deadline was 20 days away when everything changed again. Because Eleanor Thornton hadn't been idle during this period. She'd been watching their responses, evaluating their choices and preparing her final move. the one that would determine the ultimate fate of everyone involved in this tangled scandal. On a cold morning in February 1852, with 12 days remaining until Eleanor Thornton's deadline, Memphis awoke to discover that Jacob Dalton had hanged himself in his study. His wife found him at dawn, his body suspended from a ceiling beam, a note pinned to his chest. The note was brief. "I cannot live with what I've done. God forgive me for the lives I've destroyed in pursuit of profit." The suicide shocked Memphis society. Dalton had been a controversial figure, but a respected businessman. His death by his own hand suggested disgrace of a magnitude that set tongues wagging throughout the city. What had he done that drove him to such despair? What secrets had he been hiding? The whispers intensified when, 2 days later, Richard Cavendish's body was discovered in a hotel room in Nashville. Official reports listed the cause of death as heart failure, but those who saw the body noted strange bruising around his neck and evidence that he'd been in a violent struggle before death. The Nashville authorities ruled it natural causes. Cavendish's known health problems from his warehouse burns provided convenient explanation, but rumors persisted. 2 men dead within days of each other, both connected to the Marcus Thornton situation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Edmund Harrington found himself alone in defending against Eleanor's demands. Dalton was dead. Cavendish was dead. The alliance that was supposed to protect them had dissolved into nothing, and Edmund stood exposed, the only target remaining for whatever Eleanor planned next. He made his decision. Using intermediaries and coded messages, Edmund attempted to contact Eleanor Thornton. He sent word through channels he hoped she was monitoring that he wished to negotiate, to discuss terms that might satisfy her demands without completely destroying his family. To his surprise, he received a response within days. A meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a small church outside Memphis deserted during weekdays. Edmund arrived with Charles, both men armed but hoping violence wouldn't be necessary. Eleanor Thornton was waiting for them in the empty sanctuary. She was a woman in her late 40s, elegantly dressed, with a bearing that suggested refined education and considerable strength of character. Marcus stood beside her, and seeing him again, Edmund felt a strange mixture of anger, respect, and regret. "Mr. Harrington," Eleanor said without preamble, "thank you for coming. I assume recent events have made you reconsider your position regarding my demands." "Recent events," Edmund replied carefully, "have eliminated 2 of the 3 men you were targeting. Forgive me for being direct, but were you responsible for their deaths?" Eleanor's expression didn't change. Jacob Dalton killed himself rather than face what he'd done. His guilt destroyed him more effectively than any revenge I might have planned. As for Richard Cavendish, I'll simply say that men who hire violent criminals sometimes discover those criminals have their own agendas. I don't mourn his death. And now you have only me left. Yes, which brings us to this meeting. You wanted to negotiate, so negotiate. Edmund took a deep breath. Your demands would destroy my family. I'm willing to accept responsibility for my role in what happened to Marcus. I'm willing to make financial reparations. But I'm asking you to show mercy to my wife, my son, the people who depend on our household for employment. Let me bear the consequences without destroying innocent lives around me." "Innocent lives?" Eleanor's voice turned sharp. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington, were you thinking about innocent lives when you purchased my son? When you kept him in your household knowing something was wrong with the transaction? You speak of mercy now that you need it, but where was your mercy then?" "I had none," Edmund admitted. "I was wrong. I participated in something monstrous because it was legal and profitable, and I didn't want to look too closely at the ethics of it. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let the consequences fall on me alone." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Finally she said, "Your son argued for compliance at your meeting with the other families. He suggested accepting responsibility was appropriate. That was unexpected." Charles felt both of their gazes turn to him. "It seemed like the right thing to say," he offered. "But did you believe it? Or were you simply playing to your father's guilt, trying to manipulate his decision? The question struck Charles like a physical blow because it was precisely accurate. He'd been playing both sides, arguing for compliance to his father, while privately hoping for a solution that wouldn't require such devastating sacrifice. "I don't know what I believe anymore," Charles admitted. "I've been raised to think of slaves as property, business as morality neutral, profit as its own justification. But watching Marcus these past months, listening to him speak, seeing his intelligence and humanity, it's made me question everything I was taught. I don't know if compliance is right or if it's simply performative guilt. I just know that what we did to him was wrong, and someone needs to acknowledge that." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "That's more honesty than I expected. Very well. Here are my revised terms, Mr. Harrington. You will free your household slaves as I demanded. You will provide them with documentation and resources to establish new lives. You will resign from the bank boards. But I won't require public acknowledgement of your role in purchasing Marcus. That was a concession to your plea for mercy. And in return, my documentation of your crimes remains sealed. You and your family can rebuild your reputation, though it will take years and considerable effort. You'll be diminished, but not destroyed." "What about Marcus?" Charles asked. "What happens to him?" Eleanor glanced at her son, who'd remained silent throughout the entire exchange. When Marcus spoke, his voice carried weight earned through suffering. "I'm going north," Marcus said. "To Boston eventually. My mother has contacts there, people who can help me establish a new identity and a life free from this nightmare. I'll study law, maybe become an advocate for others caught in similar situations. I'll use what happened to me to help prevent it from happening to others." "That's admirable," Edmund said quietly. "Don't mistake my plans for forgiveness," Marcus replied, his tone hardening. "I'll never forgive what you did, what any of you did. But I can choose to use my experience for something constructive, rather than letting it destroy me the way guilt destroyed Mr. Dalton. That's not mercy to you. That's survival for me." The four of them stood in the empty church, the weight of recent events heavy in the air between them. Finally, Edmund nodded his acceptance of Eleanor's terms. "I'll begin freeing the slaves tomorrow. You'll have your compliance within the week. See that I do. Because if you fail to meet these terms, Mr. Harrington, I still have my documentation. I can still destroy you. This is mercy, but mercy extended only once. Don't make me regret it." They parted ways that afternoon. Eleanor and Marcus departed Memphis, heading north toward new lives and uncertain futures. Edmund and Charles returned home to begin the painful process of dismantling the foundations of their family's wealth and position. The scandal that emerged over the following months was substantial, but manageable. The Harrington family freed their slaves, provided them with documentation and funds, and withdrew from prominent social positions. Rumors circulated about financial difficulties and business reversals, but without concrete details, the gossip eventually faded. Within 2 years, the Harrington name had lost its luster, but not been entirely destroyed. They became a second-tier family, respectable, but no longer elite. The fate of the Dalton and Cavendish families was less kind. Jacob Dalton's suicide revealed financial irregularities that led to seizure of assets by creditors. The Dalton family scattered, some moving to other cities to escape the shame. Richard Cavendish's death triggered investigations that eventually revealed his involvement in several questionable business dealings. Victoria Cavendish fought to preserve the family's reputation, but ultimately failed, dying in poverty in New Orleans in 1856. As for Marcus Thornton, historical records become sparse after 1852. There are hints that a man matching his description practiced law in Boston in the 1860s, that he may have been involved in underground railroad activities, but nothing definitive. Eleanor Thornton died in Philadelphia in 1859, her obituary listing her as a widow and mother who devoted her later years to charitable work supporting former slaves. The mystery that had consumed Memphis for those fateful months gradually faded from memory, becoming just another lost story in a city with too many secrets to remember them all. But for those directly involved, the events of 1851 to 1852 remained permanently seared into memory. A reminder of how quickly power could become vulnerability, how secrets could destroy those who kept them, and how the pursuit of profit without conscience could lead to ruin. The tale of Marcus Thornton and the three families that sought to possess him reveals something profound about the world that existed in America before the Civil War. It was a world where human beings could be reduced to property, where beauty and intelligence could be commodified, where the wealthy felt entitled to own not just labor, but lives. The specifics of this story, the astronomical price paid, the competing interests, the mother's elaborate revenge, might seem extraordinary. But the underlying reality was depressingly common. Thousands of freeborn people were illegally enslaved during this period, their documentation falsified, their protests ignored, their lives destroyed by a system that valued property claims over human rights. The legal presumption always favored ownership over freedom, making it nearly impossible for an enslaved person to prove free birth, even with evidence. What makes the Marcus Thornton case unique is not that it happened, but that it left such vivid evidence of its occurrence. Most such cases vanished into history, the victims lost to time, their stories never told. That this particular story survived, even in fragmentary form, even with gaps in the historical record, speaks to the determination of those involved to document what transpired, to ensure that truth outlasted the power structures that tried to suppress it. The files that Eleanor Thornton compiled, the evidence she gathered, presumably still exist somewhere in archives or private collections. But even if the physical documentation has been lost, the pattern she exposed remains relevant. The intersection of beauty, commerce, power, and conscience that defined Marcus's story continues to echo through American history. We may no longer trade in slaves, but we still struggle with questions about who has value, who deserves dignity, and what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of profit or status. In that sense, the impossible mystery of the most beautiful male slave ever traded in Memphis isn't really about one young man in 1851. It's about all of us, the choices we make, and the legacies we leave behind. What do you think of this story? The length some people went to protect their secrets, the courage it took for others to expose them. Leave your comment below, and if you found this historical mystery compelling, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the forgotten scandals and suppressed truths of American history. Share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. These stories deserve to be remembered, and